We like to call it the Supernatural Hour. And now, our hosts.
Hey everybody, it is another episode of the Supernatural Hour. I'm your host, Castle. We've got your host, Lurch.
Sup?
We got Beaker.
What's happening?
We've got Peaches.
Hello, hello.
We have got Silent Dawn.
Hello.
And we've got Granny Cinnamon.
Hello.
Today it's going to be more of like a history, starting with the early starts of funeral directing. It's all the history into medieval England and then colonial America into what we have now.
See, and
you
my favorite,
can kind of see how it builds up off of each other. Go ahead, Deanne.
I was just say my favorite is the Victorian stuff. The stuff I've read about the Victorian funeral.
Taking
stuff.
pictures of dead people?
Yeah.
Yeah, with
Anyway,
dead people?
we shall not jump forward, but that's my favorite.
Times you get the bubonic plague. You know, you've got ancient Europe or medieval Europe, and you've got this plague that's killing thousands and thousands of people. Hundreds of people are dying every day, and they had mass burials. They had mass grave sites where they would throw these people in. At one time, I think it was around the time of the bubonic plague, or shortly before. It's the Woolen Act of 1666. I actually still remember that date, but up until that time, so many people were being buried in like linen and shrouds, and England, there's a lot of sheep there, so they said, we have all this wool, we need to make sure that we're getting some sort of compensation, some financial gain from all this wool, and so they passed a law saying that if you were to be buried, you had to be buried in wool, and it was the Woolen Act of 1666. I think shortly after that is when the bubonic plague started to happen, so the burials became less ornate. They became more simplified because there's so many more people dying. And then after a while, it was just like, let's just skip the burials and let's just get everyone out of the city, get all the disease out, and just try to stop this as best we can.
Monty Python, bring out your dead.
Bring out your dead.
Yeah.
I'm not dead yet.
Yeah. that phrase that those monks are saying is they hit themselves in the face with a paddle. They're saying, I play dominoes better than you do in Latin. Just a little side fact in case you want to look that up. I know, good stuff. But yeah, even back in medieval times, though, they had a lot of traditions that they did that even stem into colonial America. That a lot of the pilgrims from Europe, as they came over here, they brought a lot of those practices over. As people started to set up in the colonies, a lot of the original founders of the colonies were Quaker, which was a very strict type of religion. And so a lot of the sermons would be fire and brimstone, like when you die, if you're not a good person, you're going to hell. I mean, they would literally scare the people to being good, and they would preach this at the graveside.
You've heard of, was this Poveglia Island, right?
Yeah, Poveglia Island in Italy. It's outside Venice, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's well, you were talking about the plague and whatnot, and that's an island that they actually took people to if they thought you were sick for any reason. They put you on a boat and they shuttled your ass over to this island, basically to die.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the island is now like it's off limits now, but basically like there is no sand. Like when you're walking across this island, it's not a very big island either. It's very small. But basically when you're walking across this island, there's just so many bodies there that they never buried or anything. So you're basically walking across human bones and ashes and and like you can't even find the dirt.
It's like taking the dog to the vet. Hey Tim, get in the boat. We're gonna go fishing.
Yeah, fishing. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, that's the way to get me to go somewhere. Let's go fishing. That's like me saying, "Hey Gary, let's go camping."
Yeah. It was a leper colony. It was used for the plague. But yeah, a lot of deaths happened. If you see any of like the history stuff on Poveglia Island, there were doctors that wore these special masks with this huge beak, and they would fill the beak with herbs and spices because the stench was so bad. It was kind of like a filter. It was kind of like a gas mask, a medieval gas mask. And it was also very intimidating. It was very scary. If you saw this doctor wearing this mask, it's like, that's one of the last things that you see before you get carted off to this island and you're going to die.
Didn't they also believe that the herbs and stuff would protect them from contracting the disease
exactly
themselves?
Yeah. It was just kind of like a filter. It'd go over their cover their mouth and their nose, and so as they breathe in, it just kind of filter.
Those medieval
Quote,
plague
unquote,
doctor,
filter.
those medieval plague doctor masks. Those things look pretty creepy.
They are pretty creepy.
And I want one.
I want to make one out of paper mache for Halloween one of these years. So
We
that's-
got some.
I actually
Yeah.
want to do like Peaches and I have talked about this because there's a local photographer at the farmers market that
Yeah.
takes the pictures and puts them like on glass etchings.
Awesome.
So I want to do like a steampunk like plague doctor and have them take my picture and then like put that up on our website.
that's very cool.
Well, that'd be cool.
I like stuff like that. But yeah, so during the plague, of course, things get very simplified. There's mass dyings, mass death. So up until then, there's very ornate funeral practices. The funeral services would be held in the church. If you're wealthy enough, you could be buried in the churchyard, and that was kind of like a very prestigious place to be. But then, as the plague came along, they didn't have the time to do that for all the hundreds of people that were dying daily. And so that kind of got put to the wayside, and they started making these mass grave plots, and they would literally throw the people in, sprinkle some lime, and once it got full, they would, backhoe, drive their backhoe and fill it up.
Well, what's interesting too, this would have been during the early days of the church, and that's when cremation was really frowned upon. So, even though the Romans at the end of these battles would just cremate all these soldiers, they didn't dare do that in the medieval times because they thought that was basically sacrilege to burn the body.
We're talking about several hundred years, though, in time from when the Romans were, ancient Rome, when they were doing cremation, to medieval times. But yeah, I mean,
right. That's the difference. So why they didn't just burn the bodies, because they thought it was sacrilegious, and so that's why they
Exactly.
resorted to mass graves, because they didn't know what to do, and that's
Exactly.
their only option that they had.
yeah.
Well, and then they used to, when they copied like Greek mythology, I know that they would put like coins on the dead's eyes so they could
Yes.
pay the boatman that take them across the river Styx.
Yeah, and in fact, I was going to talk about that on the last episode. I had my notes. I'm giving you the evil eye, Gary. I had my notes all ready and prepped and stuff. But
You knew
yeah,
we were going to talk about this. It's not
there's-
my fault.
It was, oh man, I want to say his name was Oberon, the ferryman, who would actually take them across the river Styx, and the gold coins that the family would put on their eyes not only kept their eyes closed, but it was also a toll that they would give this embodiment of death, and it would take them across the river Styx into Hades, and that's where their soul would exist in the Elysian fields for all of eternity. And if you didn't have that fare, then your body, your soul, Charon, yeah, that's right, Charon, the ferryman, he kind of looked like Grim Reaper. He was the embodiment of death. He was a skeleton, and he would charter the boat to the river Styx. If you didn't have that toll, then your soul was kind of at unrest and never really found peace. And so it was very important that, in their mind, to have those coins over the eyes, because that would get them into the Elysian fields where they could spend all eternity being at
Which
peace.
turned into the whole popular thing with the Grim Reaper and the whole sickle and all that. So.
Absolutely. But yeah, you get into medieval times, you get into the colonies as people are starting to come over to the U.S., and you get more into some of the modern era funeral practices. When people would pass away, there were no funeral homes, so a lot of those practices were done at home. The family would bathe and dress the body. They would have a wake where they would literally lay the person out on the dining room table, and the wake would last several days. Sometimes it would take a week or so for family to travel from another state by horse and carriage to get there, and they would view the body. They would usually bring gifts. It's like today, you go to a funeral and you usually bring things. You have a comfort
potatoes?
food, potato. Yeah,
You get
the
potatoes.
funeral. So they would usually bring gifts of.
If that body's been out for 7 days, they better bring a gift of
Oh
Febreze.
boy, yeah, I can only imagine the stench. But
Well,
they bring like
place
alcohol
sushi on top
and-
of the body.
Yeah,
You eat the sushi off the body.
yeah, exactly what Tim said. They would eat sushi off the body in the colonies. And but no, people would
said so convincingly.
people would bring like alcohol, or they would bring food, and they would be there to comfort the family. But all of that was done in the home, And then people started to establish kind of niche professions. You get cabinet makers, and they would try to find multi ways to facilitate their
Business?
Yeah, their business into other things. So the cabinet makers became the casket makers, and when someone would die, they would go to the cabinet makers and say, hey, I need you to build a casket, and so they would build the casket, and the person would be buried in that. And so a lot of these really old funeral homes, I started working for one in Provo, Utah, which is about 30 or 40 miles south of Salt Lake. I started working, the very first place that I did my internship, it had been owned by the same family for a couple of generations, but that's literally how that funeral home started, was that the guy that opened it up, he was a carpenter, he was a cabinet maker, and just out of the need for having caskets, he facilitated that need by providing the means to have a funeral, and so he became known as the funeral director. But a lot of people would take on those different professions and try to help out, and so a lot of these jobs had multi uses, and I just kind of lost my train of thought. But you see kind of a lot of the pomp and circumstance coming back into play again. There's a lot of old burials where they would have ornate carriages with lots of feathers and flowers, and even the horses would be decorated. They usually have black horses to draw the carriages, and the carriages would have these large bay windows, so you could see the casket inside there, or the person resting on top of the bier inside the casket, or inside the cart. And there would be long processions to the graveside, and so just over time, evolution to what we have today, and a lot of the things that we still practice today have stems in those ancient practices, like having a luncheon after the funeral. It's comfort food. It's doing something to help comfort the family. I'm trying to think of other examples off the top of my head, and I'm kind of drawing a blank here.
Well, it's interesting, along with kind of almost modern stuff, and it's really not that far gone, but for a long time, the funeral director and the ambulance were one and the same.
Yes.
You called
the coroner
the ambulance, and basically they show up with the hearse, and if you make it to the hospital, you're fine, and if you don't, well, you just take it back.
Take a little detour. We're going to, bypass the hospital and go straight to the home.
Shouldn't you be doing CPR?
I have an uncle. I have an uncle, and that's what his family did. The little town up in Wyoming, northern Wyoming, and they had the furniture shop, they had the mortuary, and they had the ambulance service.
And I know that in Utah, it is the way that most of the U.S. is, but there are a few states still. I know Idaho. I don't know if Idaho's changed, but when I was in school, Idaho had. It was kind of one and the same. The coroner and the funeral director were the same. You would go to school to become a funeral director, but when you'd get your license, you could also be a licensed coroner, and so you could help pronounce the person dead at the scene of the death. We don't have that here in Utah, and I think most of the U.S. isn't. But a coroner is actually someone who's gone to medical school. They've done years of internship. They've studied forensic pathology. They've studied all kinds of schooling to get their accreditation, and they're basically doctors. But what they do is they do the autopsies, and they determine the cause of death, if it was like homicide or accident or suicide or something else, poisoning. But that's not how it is here in Utah. The coroner and the funeral director are two different entities. The medical examiner is kind of the more PC term that we use these days instead of coroner, where they'll actually get the body up there at the medical examiner's office, and you have these doctors that are very highly accredited, that know their stuff, and they will actually perform like an autopsy and take out all the viscera and weigh everything. They'll get little samples of everything, and they'll do testing for pathogens. They'll do testing for intoxicants, whether it's drugs or alcohol or all kinds of things. It's pretty simple if someone committed suicide that it was lead poisoning, that self-inflicted gunshot to the head was the cause of death. But even in situations like that, the medical examiner first takes them in, they look at the body, they examine it, and they're like, okay, yeah, this person, it was definitely a self-inflicted gunshot to the head, and that's what the cause of death is. But if it's something that requires a little bit more examination. They will do some very detailed stuff with autopsies and getting fluid samples and testing blood, testing urine, testing the different organs with the samples for toxogens and intoxicants. So,
I was still just amazed by the toxogens. No, and it's interesting because I actually deal with that end of it a little bit. And so what happens, and I think we maybe even touched on this a little bit last time, but if somebody dies, basically if you call the police department, they come and determine whether or not the person's seen a doctor in the last 60 or 90 days. I can't remember which it is off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But we'll try and call that doctor, and if the doctor says, yeah, we expected them to pass away because they were old or they had all these health problems, then we say, okay, fantastic, and we call the funeral director, and they do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
But if they haven't seen a doctor, nobody's entirely sure why they may have died.
It gets complicated.
Then you call the medical examiner's office, and they actually send an investigator, which is usually a police officer or retired police officer from another agency that's been hired specifically to be more or less a death detective, for lack of a better term. And they come and do an examination of the scene, take a bunch of photos, assign it a case number, and then they send it up to the coroner that you're talking about, who does the autopsy and tries to determine cause of death. Part of that is because, your example of lead poisoning, gunshot wound to the head, they're going to look at that, and even though that may seem like the obvious cause of death, they're going to look at some other things and make sure that it's not staged to look like that.
Exactly.
They weren't actually poisoned and then somebody put a gun in their hand and fired around and then called the police.
Exactly, because sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
Oh no, you're fine. I was gonna say, and so they look into all that stuff just to make sure that there's nothing fishy, and more often than not, if there's something fishy, they're gonna find it.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of times I ran into that situation where families would come in and mom or dad had been healthy and they suddenly got sick and passed away at home, and they hadn't been to a doctor in years. They didn't have a family practitioner. The medical examiner's office wouldn't take them. And so it was really a challenge trying to find someone, a doctor, that would sign off on a death certificate. A lot of doctors would refuse to sign the death certificate because they didn't want that on their resume, so to speak.
Their liability.
Yeah, their liability. And it's really kind of ridiculous because all we need is just a signature. It doesn't matter who signs it. We just need a doctor.
They're definitely dead.
Yeah, to sign off and say, okay, this person died from these causes. I may not have had them in my practice in the last few years, but all we need is a signature. And a lot of doctors would be really kind of buttheads about it because they didn't want that on the resume that they signed off on a death certificate. They didn't want anyone to know that anyone died underneath their pen. Anyone died on their watch, so to speak. So
Right.
Just ridiculous. A lot of behind the scenes stuff that most people don't know about that are really kind of childish in a way. But yeah, doctors could be one of them. And for being such a noble profession as it is, I loved being a funeral director, but I'm going to tell you, there was a lot of behind the scenes stuff with my coworkers, a lot of drama, a lot of people trying to climb their way up the corporate ladder, so to speak. And they won't have, I don't know, I'm speaking from my experience. You might have, if you're a funeral director listening to this, you might have had a completely different experience. But from what I experienced during the 10 years that I practiced it, at the funeral homes that I worked at, the 4 or 5 different funeral homes I worked at, there was a lot of drama and a lot of people that are willing to do some pretty low-handed stuff for their own personal benefit, for their own personal gain, to climb up the ladder and become the next boss. Really stupid.
Well, and before we end that, the one thing about the whole funeral, I don't want to say profession, because again, there's fantastic people, and if you're a funeral director listening to this, this is nothing on you, but the expense, in my opinion, has gotten to be to the point that it's absurd. When you left, what was the rough overall bill for everything?
So first and foremost, when you sit down with a funeral director, there's going to be a basic services fee. Usually that's between about $500 to $3,000, and what that is just a fee to say we're sitting down with a funeral director, and he's going to start, or she is going to plan the services for me. It's going to cover the cost of us filing paperwork. It's going to cover the cost of our own building expenses, of paying utilities, of of everything. It's just a flat, non-disclosable, but non-negotiable fee. It's a flat fee before you even pay for anything. Here's a bill. You have $2,500. Bam, right there, and that's going to cover my salary to sit down with you for the next 2 or 3 hours and to plan this, and then to work with you over the next few days to take care of the actual funeral service itself. So you have that first, and then it's all depending upon what families want on top of that, what type of casket they want. You can get a very meager looking casket for just a few $100s. Most caskets that I saw were in the price range of about $1,200 to $1,500. This is something that you'll see for a few hours that the person's in before it's buried into the ground. And then after the casket, you're talking cost of death certificates, you're talking flowers. Flowers, are, especially funeral flowers, you get one arrangement and you're looking at about $200 or $300 per arrangement. So I've seen families spend several $1,000s just on flowers alone. Anything else on top of that, some families choose to have catering. We would have catering options where we could provide a caterer. So while you're at the visitation or after the funeral service, you can come back to the funeral home and we'd have a banquet room where you and 50 of your close family and friends could sit down to a full meal. And it could be anything from like finger foods to like prime rib and seafood and everything in between. But yeah, after it's all said and done, after the casket, after the cost of the vault, and I think I talked about the vault. The vault is a concrete box that goes into the plot after it's been dug. It goes down into the plot first, and that's going to be what the casket actually goes into. The coffin goes into the vault, and then the lid goes on the vault, and then the plot is backfilled. And the reason why we have vaults is so that there's no sinkholes, because eventually over time, if it's a wooden casket or even a metal casket, the weight of all the vehicles going over the ground, you got backhoes still having to open up other plots, so they'll drive across the ground. You have dump trucks that have to hold the dirt that the backhoe is digging up. All these vehicles are going over the ground, and if you didn't have the vault, then the weight of those vehicles would actually crush the casket underneath the ground. And so the vaults would just provide structure so everything looks flat and level and you don't have sinkholes all over the place. But yeah, by the time you have everything paid for, the average cost of a funeral home, at last I remember, you're looking about $10,000 to $12,000. And that's average. You can scrimp and you can cut that back a little bit. I've seen people go to about $7,000 or $8,000. I've seen people that could afford more and they've done $18,000, $20,000 for a burial. There's a lot of different variants. The flowers can be a big variant. The casket itself, I've seen caskets that have sold for $4,000 or $5,000. And
I'm sure the headstone can get expensive.
The headstone too.
What you want to do.
Yeah, the actual property itself, again, a couple $1,000s. The vault, a couple $100, $1,000 or $2,000 for the vault. And then the maintenance. Usually you have these cemeteries that are privately owned that will do like a perpetual care. That's the exact term that we use, perpetual care service, where you don't have to worry about the ground ever being mowed because they would take care of that. They would trim up around the headstones. They would mow the cemeteries and maintain it. And so, but you have private cemeteries that sometimes don't get visited that often, or you have government-owned cemeteries like the VA cemeteries. And so there's all these little quote-unquote hidden fees. I used to tell people there's no hidden fees. That's BS. Burials are filled with hidden fees. And it's kind of sad because it's a very troubling and difficult time for families. You're not only dealing with the emotional burden of having someone die, but then you're also dealing with the financial obligations that come with it. And I've seen people that have had everything planned and paid for, and it's so refreshing because they don't have to worry about that. They just sit there, they plan out some of the details, and it's already paid for. And then I've seen other people on the other end of the spectrum that are struggling to, just live paycheck to paycheck, and mom's dead, and it's like, how are we going to come up with $10,000 to bury her? And it's difficult being put in that position because you're trying to take care of their needs and provide a service for them, but at the same time, you're an employee of a business, and you have to kind of walk that fine line of doing what's good for the business, but also taking care of the family at the same time.
I always wonder that when I see on the news, when 3 or 4 people die in an unexpected traffic accident or something like that, and just kind of in my mind go, ugh.
And usually in situations like that, I've seen a lot of other people step in, a lot of anonymous donations. With the GoFundMe accounts today, I've seen a lot of people do that as well. There are ways to kind of bump the system, I guess. If you're seriously impoverished, there are ways that the government can help out. We used to have government cremations, state cremations, where if you qualified, if your income was less than a certain amount of dollars, then they would provide, the government would provide assistance to pay the funeral home for a free cremation. But I've also see people take advantage of that, where a lady came in one time and she, basically lied on the application, got qualified for a free cremation, and then within the next few days, you see this multi-column obituary running in several newspapers for several days. And obituaries, that's several $100s a day. You're talking like $700-800 for a small 2 or 3 paragraph, maybe like 5 inches long in a column. They charge per character. That's really expensive. A lot of people don't post obituaries in the newspaper anymore because no one really takes a newspaper delivery like they do. You can go online, but even to have it posted online through the newspaper, several $100s. But this lady, she had taken advantage of the system. We saw a several column, long obituary posted for several days in both of the Salt Lake newspapers. She drove up to the funeral home when she revisited us in this very nice Mercedes. And it's sad to see people take advantage of help like that. It's there for people that actually need it, not for you to abuse the system and to take advantage of it and to get a cheap burial or a cheap cremation.
Well, that's all kind of interesting stuff. I'm glad we covered this topic.
I still think like the whole concept of like burying someone and then go visiting their grave later is just weird.
See, and that's why a lot of people are steering towards cremation nowadays, is because there's a lot of different options with cremation. I would always recommend to people, even if they're cremating, to have a memorial service, to celebrate their life. It gives closure to people. They can all come together, they can laugh together, they can cry together, they can share stories, they can bond, they can work through that transition in their life of grief and dealing with the loss. But then it's also good to also have a place where they can go and visit that person and know that they're there, whether it's at a cemetery or somewhere else of your choosing. You can take the remains, you can scatter them somewhere in the woods, you can build your own memorial somewhere, build a shrine in your backyard, whatever you want to do. You can keep the ashes in your home, in your closet, but just having some place where you and your children and your family can go to and know that they're there and just have that feeling of peace, like, okay, Dad's there, and when I go and visit there, I can feel him, and I can know that he's kind of with me, and I can talk to him, and that's very comforting. A lot of people don't really do that, and they struggle for years afterwards with finding that closure, finding that transition, and moving past it. So there's a lot of things I used to recommend to families that were part of the process as well. But cremation as well, there's a lot of options. You can take part of the ashes, you can have them placed into jewelry, you can have yourself turned into a diamond, you can be pressed into a diamond, you can be pressed into a vinyl record now, I saw the other day, which I think is cool. And the record can either have a soundtrack that you pick of songs that they might have listened to, or it could be like ambient sounds of a place where they used to visit, like an open air market, and that's what the vinyl record would play, and it holds like 20 minutes of sound on each side, but it actually has part of the remains in there. You can be blasted off into space, you can be launched in a shuttle, and they can blast you off into space like they did with Gene,
Cernan?
The founder of Star Trek.
Roddenberry.
Gene Roddenberry. Yeah, Gene Roddenberry was blasted into space on a rocket that launched up a satellite like 20, 30 years ago, whenever he passed away.
I can't imagine that's cheap.
So he's somewhere out there in the cosmos floating around in his ashes.
Maybe it's just different for me because of what we do, where I realize that like when you die, like, yeah, your body's buried in the ground over there, but I don't need to go to your body to be able to talk to you. Like, if you crossed over, you could be sitting right next to me and hearing everything I say. I don't need to go find your body to talk to you.
Exactly.
I guess it's just like, a comfort thing for some people.
It's for the living.
It's-
Funerals are for the living.
Well, and I get that, but I mean, it's like I've never really understood the concept of like going and visiting somebody's grave, because I remember when my parents used to make me do it when I was younger. Like, we're gonna go visit grandma, and I'm just like,
Yep.
okay.
Yeah. See, and I know where my grandma and grandpa are buried. They were buried at the cemetery where I used to work for several years. And it took me probably 2 or 3 years of working there before I actually finally visited their grave. Because in my mind, I knew where they were, but I didn't need to be there to have that peace. I mean, it's great to have that comfort and knowledge that I can go and visit them at any time. But to me, I can kind of relive my own memories and find comfort in that with my memories. And I don't necessarily need to go to a physical location to have that quote unquote communication, I guess.
My
Well,
grandma's with me, so.
That's you're lucky.
I was going to say, which goes into what I was about to say, and I think Tim hit it on the head, and that's when you do paranormal investigations, and if you believe in that kind of stuff, it kind of puts all this stuff in a whole different perspective, where that's not necessarily something that you need to do to go to that place.
And this is something we've talked about before, that oftentimes people don't always cross over because of whatever circumstances. It might have been sudden and unexpected death, that they aren't quite ready, that there's something unresolved, that they might not feel that they've lived a worthy life of crossing over and having that fear of standing before God and Christ and being judged for their actions during this life. So there's a lot of reasons why human spirits will stay behind. They have something unresolved, or they're the fear of the afterlife.
Or they just choose not to.
Or they choose not to. And so that's why they tend to wander around. And we've come across several spirits that did just that. You know, they lost their way. They forgot why they didn't cross over. And they have no way of getting back. And we've helped them in those situations with helping them find their spouse or their family, or just helping them to get where they need to go.
We've also come across a couple of spirits that have been instructed not to cross over. Like Annie.
Everybody looks at Peaches.
Yes.
Why are
Yeah.
you looking at me?
No.
Well, and it's like the same
Yeah.
with
Annie
my...
needs to stay here.
It's the same with like my aunt. I'm pretty sure that there's, she died at 7 of leukemia, and she's been with my dad ever since. And I'm pretty sure that it wasn't like a fear thing that kept her from going or whatever. It's she had an assignment that she needed to do.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure when my dad passes, she'll either come with me or she'll go with my dad. But I mean, it's one of those things where it's just like, I'm pretty sure there are certain spirits that are like, hey, you still have a function to do. It's like Native American spirits, for example. They're put in charge of protecting a certain area of land, and they don't feel that death releases them from that charge. Like, they're still protecting that land, and we've come across it a lot. Like Laura Hicks' house, for example.
I would say almost every Native American spirit we've come across has stayed behind to basically guard the land. That's what they were.
And I'm really fascinated by that too. I'm fascinated by the whole Native American culture in like the pre-Columbus time, when they were very connected to nature, and Western man over the last 100 years or so has become very disconnected with nature. But their beliefs about how God was everywhere. You can't own medieval because it's given to everyone, and you can't own certain things because it's given to everyone, and just that mentality that they're very connected with nature. And I just think that's really fascinating. If there was ever a time that I could go back to and just kind of be a fly on the wall, I think pre-Columbus Native America would be one of those. There were a lot of it was very brutal. It was very it could be very good and evil, but they had some really cool beliefs when it came to life and when it came to death.
Yeah, I'd agree. Well, we probably need to wrap this up. We will call this an episode.
You've been listening to the Supernatural Hour at AdvancedParanormal.com. The Supernatural Hour is part of the Radio Ronin network, found at RadioRonin.com. Copyright by Advanced Paranormal Services.